Hello to all of you in the Philippines. I am delighted to have been invited to join you for this momentous anniversary and celebration of CFM in the Philippines. My parents, Pat and Patty Crowley, were proud of your movement over the years. Now, last year, I spent almost a year in Namibia with the Tutsing Benedictines. And one day, shortly after I arrived there, one sister came up to me in the dining room and asked if I were the daughter of Pat and Patty Crowley. I couldn't have been more surprised. Sister Angeline told me that she had read my letter to the Philippine CFM group a previous year and that she was a friend of the Sison family. Such a small world. There was Sister Angeline from the Philippines, and there was I in Namibia, West Africa. Through that connection, I was able to talk on WhatsApp to Sunny Sison. What a treasure that was. In my life, whenever I meet someone who comes from a CFM family, I feel a strong bond. Now today, you have invited me to reflect on the role of CFM in my family and also in my vocation. I will do so. And at the end, I will offer you what I see as some of the challenges in our church and in our world today. I thank you for this opportunity. Now, my father was the chronicler of our family. My mother was the keeper of scrapbooks. In the mid-1950s, when my parents took a trip around the world and stopped in the Philippines for the first time, which is 65 years ago, and then when I left home, my father started a newsletter that kept everybody in the family and extended family in touch. I want to share some excerpts from my parents' newsletter about these stops in the Philippines, the one that began the CFM and then one a couple of years later. He says, "We were greeted, as usual, by a great delegation. Lope and Mary Jane Ballardo, Noni, Mike, Therese, Cesar, Eddie and his lovely wife, and Therese and Tony Nieva. The Nievas summarily dismissed our suggestion that we go to a hotel and hustled us off to their gorgeous new home in elegant Forbes Park, where the whole group assembled for dinner. The next day, Jess Paradis, a wonderful lawyer, teacher, and all-around leading Catholic man, took us to see the Archbishop. His Excellency was most cordial, gracious, and encouraging. He approved CFM on the spot." This is followed by descriptions of visiting the University of Santo Tomas, the Jesuit College, the Philippine University, Maryknoll College, St. Scholastica College, and Father Hogan, the Philippines labor priest, who stirred things up and will continue to do so, according to my dad. "Manila is a remarkable place," he says. "The people are extremely gracious. The family spirit is remarkable." The text then describes some of the problems faced by the Philippines at that time: unemployment, high prices, low wages, lack of labor organizing. He goes on to say the church is strong, but organized from the top down. The layman's role is not too well understood. We tried to stress the need for concern for Christian organizations of all aspects of life to show that a Catholic culture could save all these institutional problems. In 1967, when they visited the Philippines again, he described, "In the Philippines, we detected great enthusiasm among the laity in all aspects of the church's work. The Cursillo movement is popular and has been spearheaded by CFM. Fortunately, these two efforts cooperate beautifully, and the Philippine church appears to be enjoying a surge of lay Catholics. CFMers in the Philippines are happily young. One of the things that interested us was that class distinctions are dying. People in CFM groups came from far and near, from the country and the city, and from various social and economic strata. About 1,500 attended the enthusiastic 10th anniversary. So, how did CFM affect my life, affect our family life? I would say that the two-pronged emphasis of CFM, both gospel reflection and social action, are the two key elements. I grew up living and breathing that spirit. CFM is a brilliant and a practical way to approach gospel living. As you know, each meeting begins with a reflection on the gospel or on another New Testament reading and ends with an action on some social issue. The clergy present do not participate except perhaps at the very end with a comment. What a good model for our still emerging Vatican II Church. So I'll tell you a couple of things about our family. Life changed in our household when I was 8. My mother had given birth to my younger sister, Kathy, and afterwards had almost died. My parents, recognizing that they could not have any more natural children, began to look into the process of welcoming foster children into our home. The process began with our welcoming 4-year-old Algimantas Augustinavičius from Lithuania, after that known as Algie. I don't really know if that was the result of a CFM action, but it definitely changed our lives. Algie and TC, the last of the foster children, who was ultimately adopted, remained with us over the years and are now counted as 2 of my siblings. When I was 11 and given my own little bedroom at the head of the stairs, I was very happy. It turned out that the Benedictine community in Lisle, Illinois, had reached out to my parents to invite a young woman from Czechoslovakia to Easter for the weekend. Sonia Kuchera came for the weekend and then returned to live with us full-time for her college at Mundelein. To her was given my bedroom for the next 4 or 5 years, and I went back to the girls' dorm. That was only the beginning. Our next family expansion was foreign students. This was definitely the result of a CFM action. The group in Wilmette had become aware that many students who were from other countries and were studying at Northwestern University had no place to go over the holidays. As I was a teenager at the time, I thought it was just great to have young, handsome men from other countries visiting our home. CFM actions did become our life. My father was always seeking new trends in our society and in our world, and as a result, we had many famous visitors. I will mention only 2. One was Julius Nyerere, a student from Tanzania who was studying at the University of Chicago. He later became the first prime minister of Tanganyika, which was the previous name of Tanzania, and later president of that country. Now he is being considered for sainthood within the Catholic Church. He was an anti-colonial activist, a politician, and a political theorist, and a deeply spiritual human being. In 1974, just a few months prior to my father's death, I traveled with them to Tanzania for a meeting co-sponsored with the World Council of Churches, and it was called Familia 74. I believe the Philippines CFM was represented at that meeting. The second famous gift guest was Sergeant Shriver and his wife Eunice Kennedy of the famous Kennedy family. One night, we all had dinner early and had cleaned up, and the children had gone their own ways when a knock came on the door. And my father graciously welcomed Sarge and Eunice Shriver for dinner, to which he had invited them. My mother, as my father was entertaining them, went to the kitchen and prepared a meal and ate dinner again. Luckily, none of us children spilled the beans. Another action. Our local parish was typical at the time, with a priest who was supportive of CFM, but who did little to actually implement their suggestions. One example of an action was to encourage people to read more about new theology, new ideas in liturgy, new ideas in social justice. So with another couple, my parents spearheaded the establishment of a small parish library in the vestibule of our church and worked to keep it stocked with cutting-edge writings. I, for one, began to read such things in high school. Another action was to introduce children to people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds and economic backgrounds. My parents did two definite things to introduce us to this reality in our society. Each Christmas season, we would take turns going with one of my parents to deliver food and toys to the families who were connected to Marillac House on the west side of Chicago. I have vivid memories of realizing the stark differences between those homes and ours. My father often took one of my brothers with him when he did his weekly visit to people who were elderly and poor. This was connected to the little brothers, Friends of the Elderly, and I'm not really sure what impact that had on my brothers, but I was always impressed with that regular activity of my dad's. Summers were often used to prepare for the CFM conventions at Notre Dame. My friends and I were recruited as official babysitters. I believe that having babysitters there was the result of a CFM action. With sometimes 4,500 people in attendance, you can imagine that it was hectic. We did get to meet some of the emerging greats of our times in theology, liturgy, music. They were there addressing the large group of couples, but we were able to meet them over meals. I have to admit that my younger siblings experienced life quite differently from what I knew. I share but my experience. The second part that you asked me to address was CFM's influence on my vocation. I'm a Benedictine woman for many years, and at some point, Pat and Patty, my parents, became oblates at St. John's Monastery Abbey in Minnesota. I think it was for two reasons. Because of the experts there, Virgil Michael, on liturgy, and because of their social justice work in the area. That's, I think, what attracted them. And it could have been from a CFM action influence. My father grew to love the rule. He loved being the abbot. He loved calling everybody to a meeting to consult on decisions that need to be made or things that were planned for the coming week. And after Sunday Mass, he would even ask us to share one thought about the gospel. Sometimes we remembered what it was. Another influence was that Pat and Patty attended daily Mass in our local parish. at 6:30 in the morning, and I often went with them. When my dad didn't go, he would attend Mass downtown at St. Peter's Church, which is a block from his law office. So I loved the Benedictines. I loved daily liturgy from my family. And as I reflect on how CFM influenced my vocation, I'm realizing that the nature of CFM is to encourage people to seek out new ways of thinking, reflecting on the scriptures, and of taking action. In their role as leaders, my parents were always aware of the cutting edge of thinking in our world and in our church. They invited people like Hans Kung, Bernard Herring, Lou Savory, and other experts in our church, in the pre-Vatican church. They even introduced Teilhard de Chardin to me. I think that I learned early on the importance of always seeking out new ideas and acting in new ways that were gospel-based as essential to a full life. Gospel reflection and action are the pillars of my spiritual life, along with the Benedictine encouragement to learn to pray always. The love of regular Eucharistic celebration certainly began in childhood, as did the urging to always seek God, which is the charism of Benedictines throughout the world. The basis of CFM approach was to observe or see, to judge, and to act. That certainly influenced who I am and who I became as a Benedictine woman, not afraid to speak out. So what is the challenge that CFM has given to us today? You know that in the late 60s, my parents were invited by John the 23rd to participate in a newly established commission to study the reality of birth control among Catholics in the church. Their contribution was to work with researchers at Notre Dame University to survey CFM couples around the world about their experience using birth control. Based on that data and the testimony of experts in theology, church history, science, and more, they, along with 90% of their commission members, came to the conclusion that the teaching of the church needed to change. History tells us that in 1968, Pope Paul VI issued Humanae Vitae and thereby ignored that advice from the commission members. This decision deeply affected our church and certainly deeply affected my parents. They were faithful Catholics until their deaths, and their motivation to work for church reform was deep. My father was diagnosed with cancer just 2 years after the publication of that encyclical and died 4 years later. My mother lived until 2005 and only began to speak out publicly about that experience 25 years after its publication. After that, she never was hesitant to speak. She spoke her mind about church justice and about social justice issues. We are called to do the same with deep faith and courage. Another issue that both of them recognized was the role or lack thereof of women in the church. My father always recognized the gifts of women, and my mother, after my father's death, took as her new call to gather women to reflect, as CFM had done with couples. She did it gently most of the time, and firmly. We have a long way to go in this arena these days, even though we have come a great distance, even in the time since her death in 2005. 2 years after her death, a straggling group of activists gathered at her grave, and Bob McClory, who had written a book about her story on the Birth Control Commission, prayed a litany to which we all responded in Patty's inimitable words, "That's ridiculous." It fit her so well, for she often responded with those words when she heard seemingly unjust or ungospel-like decisions promulgated by our church authorities sometimes and by our society. Now, Pope Francis encourages us to act as Jesus did and to always be on the margins of society where the most vulnerable of human beings are. I have recently been teaching a course on the new encyclical called Fratelli Tutti. While I can be critical of the title and the lack of resources by women theologians that are used in that document, I believe the writing has a powerful message for us all to find new ways of thinking about our relationships and our solidarity with one another throughout the world, and especially with those who are the most vulnerable. In my country, this leads me to work to welcome migrants who come to our borders without resources and to work against the terrible racism that is so ingrained in our citizens. Pope Francis is working to reform the church from the inside and is meeting criticism there too. We, as Vatican II Catholics, are called to support these efforts and to work for greater social justice everywhere. I believe that we are called to prepare the ground for the future of our church. Very different after this pandemic, I believe. I believe that CFM paved the way among laity for Vatican II, for the radical teachings of Gaudium et Spes, one of the documents on the church, and of Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on sacred liturgy, among other documents. So in society, what's our challenge? As I referred to Pope Francis's letter, Fratelli Tutti, one of the challenges is migration, one of the enormous issues of our day, with its root in colonialism, climate change, capitalism, and the inimitable search for power among nations. I think another huge issue is the gap between the rich and the poor. This is true in your country as well as in mine. CFM right now would be on that issue. In all of this, you and I are called to be transformed and to influence our world and our church in whatever ways we can, so that all will recognize other human beings as brothers and sisters in solidarity in the divine. In the Benedictine spirit, we are called to seek God daily. At my mother's funeral, my eldest nephew and I were asked to give brief eulogies. My message to you is the same as my message to the throngs that were gathered that day at Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago on that rainy first day of December in 2005. Take some action. Do something every day. Speak out, but don't just talk. Each of us is called to reflect daily on the gospel message and to take whatever small or great action we can to address the injustices in our church and in our society. CFM gives us the model for how to do that. The work of the gospel now belongs to each of us. For in the words of Teresa of Avila, we are the hands and feet of the Christ today. Thank you again for inviting me to address you on this 65th anniversary of CFM in the Philippines. Congratulations. Thank you.